Welcome back. We're discussing U.S. efforts to engage more vigorously in Latin America. Last year, President Obama promised a new era in relations with nations in the region, but critics say Washington showed a lack of resolve on critical issues such as trade, relations with Cuba, and the coup in Honduras. Discussing this, I have with me Michael Shifter from the Inter-American Dialogue, a US-based non-profit organization for policy analysis on issues related to the Western Hemisphere, and Joy Olson from the Washington office on Latin America, who works on promoting greater transparency of US military programs as well as its foreign policy towards the region. We've got a caller on the line from the UK. Shaukat, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask?
Yes, I'd like to ask, isn't the problem is most people do not understand where U.S. stands on policies regarding Latin America, Guantanamo Bay, Iran, Israeli-Palestinian issues. At least in the previous administration with Bush, although most people didn't like them, I didn't like their policies, but at least you knew where they stood with their policies. That's
a very interesting point, Shaukat. Actually, Joy Olson, is there an ambiguity about the Obama administration's policies that leave people unclear on where the president and his team is trying to go?
Well, you know, I think that they've stated with the big speech at the beginning of last year where they want to go. They haven't really laid out program that takes them in that direction, to having a changed relationship with the region, having something distinct from the last administration, and I think that's what's been so frustrating to people.
One thing is that the region seems to be moving on, and Michael Shifter, one of the key things is that it looks like a regional bloc is forming that essentially leaves America out and to some degree makes the OAS, the Organization of American States, redundant. What's the progress on that? What impact is that likely to have?
Well, this has been, I think this has been a long idea. This didn't just happen this year. This has been a long-term process, and there was a decision made in Cancun on February 21st, 22nd to create this organization. It's going to be formally launched in Caracas, Venezuela next year in July of 2011. Excludes the United States and Canada. And it does sort of express, I think, a political desire to get some independence from the United States. And the OAS, clearly it's a major challenge for the OAS where the United States and Canada are involved. The question is, are these two compatible? Does one mean the demise of the other? Can they coexist? Can they function together? I think they can, but it really depends on what the nature of this organization is. We still don't know. It's still very early, and how also the United States responds and how the OAS responds. But it clearly is a challenge. It's a changing landscape that reflects the political realities that are being transformed, and we'll see how it develops.
And Joy, also one of the key things, one of the clouds that hangs over U.S. policy in Latin America is the relationship with Cuba. And I guess a lot of people are wondering, why hasn't there been any real progress in that? Why has it stuck so deep in it? You know, why is it so entrenched?
Well, that is a big question. Why hasn't that policy shifted yet? I think it was one that people expected not to change overnight, but that there would be some movement. And there really, for example, there was an expectation that travel between the U.S. and Cuba would be opened up more, and that hasn't even happened yet. It's U.S.-Cuba policy for many years has been more a domestic policy than a foreign policy, and there is, you know, a sector within the Cuban American community in the United States that very much opposes re-engagement with Cuba, and they have held great political influence over the past decades.
So, I mean, is that promise of greater engagement that President Obama made about Cuba really, has it really been completely let down? And I guess you'd mentioned Guantanamo Bay earlier on as well. Presumably the same kind of feeling with that as well.
Obama didn't make big promises on changing Cuba policy. There was an expectation that it would be reconsidered, but we haven't seen much movement in that direction. When it comes to Guantanamo, it was his statements were very clear that it was his intention to close Guantanamo. He still talks about it being his intention. It's just taking a really long time, and there's a good deal of frustration with this. And until it happens, what you still have are people who are being detained without having been tried.
The issue of Venezuela and its strong and very prominent leader, Hugo Chavez, was one that always came up with when it came to the difficult relations between the US and Latin America, certainly Venezuela. In light of what's been happening recently, certainly with Brazil and some of the other issues we've been talking about, where does Venezuela sit in all of this now?
Well, I think Venezuela, the big change with the Obama administration is that we brought ambassadors back to Caracas and Washington, but I don't think the ambassadors have much to do in each of the cities. So there's very little communication, not to mention cooperation between the two countries. I think it's been pretty much frozen. And I think the issue we talked about before, Iran and the alliance between Iran and the Venezuelan government of Hugo Chavez, makes it very, very difficult for there to be any progress on either side. So I don't really see much happening. At the same time, the oil is flowing. Economically, it's never been, the connection has never been greater in some ways. So there's nothing happening on the diplomatic front, but economically and trade in terms of trade, things continue to go forward.
Well, the critics did expect that President Obama would be stronger on the human rights issue, which is always something that's been raised in Latin America, and it seems the administration hasn't really raised that issue as much as it was expected. I
think it's partly a reaction to the Bush administration of sort of hammering away at that issue and not getting very far, in fact, being counterproductive. In the case of Venezuela, end up bolstering Chavez. Chavez is very skillful in taking advantage of those kind of criticisms and denunciations. And I think the Obama administration perhaps went too far in the other direction. I think it may be heading back to take a more affirmative stand, a more critical stand, without being too confrontational towards the Chavez administration.
We had an email that came in, Joy Olson, if I could put this to you. It comes from a viewer by the name of Justus Ndungo Tiongo, who sent it via Facebook, saying, Americans are very good people and many can be relied upon, but relying and trusting their administration would be the greatest mistake one can make. I mean, that's a standard thing when it comes to governments. A lot of people feel very insecure about policies, I guess. But is there essentially a honeymoon period for President Obama that's over now? Does he have to make some serious moves to show that he's seriously engaging with Latin America?
I think so. I think the honeymoon is over, and that it's not just that that not much happened. It's that bad things happened during the first year. That the response to Honduras was so inadequate, and not just inadequate in terms of being wishy-washy at the beginning, but then announcing that they would recognize the elections before the elections, kind of declaring them fair before they even happened, and then the announcement of the negotiation of a new access to bases in Colombia, military bases in Colombia. That was also incredibly controversial. It was done in a very not transparent fashion. So in the time when they're talking about renewed engagement, establishing a new relationship, you see that on the military side that they've negotiated this base arrangement, and their neighbors didn't know about it, and so it builds distrust.
Just a thought, Mr. Shifter, when Hillary Clinton wraps up her trip, what difference do you think will this trip have made? What will change from her doing this?
Well, I think in the best of circumstances, it will prepare the ground. The President Obama will probably go to the region. South America's first trip ever to South America in the next couple of months, probably before June or July. And I think she's preparing the ground for that moment of re-engagement to try to pick up where he left off almost a year ago at the Summit of the Americas, and to try to tackle these issues, because the agenda has gotten sidetracked. And I think what she could achieve with this trip is sort of getting back, restarting, and at least getting Latin Americans to sort of at least give the Obama administration another chance. And then President Obama will see if he can deliver something more concrete.
I thank you very much both for your participation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us too. Now, of course, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, harsh justice for child criminals or a crackdown on Kurdish political dissent? We look at Turkey's controversial terrorism law that treats children as adults, giving them heavy penalties in prison for so-called acts of terror. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.